The blood-stained pavement. It's a funny thing, purred Joyce Lemprière, the artist. Now that it is my turn to tell a story, the only mystery I've ever personally encountered, I find myself at a loss for where to begin. 5 years have passed, and one really ought to have put such horrors out of mind, but they linger. I must warn you, my story is woven of 2 colors, pink and black. At first, the whole affair seemed so amusing, so utterly mundane, only at the very end did it twist into a somber drama. Even the painting I was working on at the time leaves a strangely dual impression. At a glance, it is a steep street in a typical Cornish village, bathed in sunlight. But look a moment longer, and something sinister begins to peer through the angularity of the houses. I never offered it for sale. On some sudden whim, I shoved it into the darkest corner of my studio, face to face with the wall. I simply cannot bear to look at it again. The village, a place called Rathole, was a picturesque haven for fishermen. Perhaps a touch too picturesque, as if it were practically begging to be captured on a genre canvas. The eye rested easy on its narrow streets, yet simultaneously registered something unnatural. Deep within the cramped shops, shrouded in gloom, one could see the figures of young girls bent over an obsolete craft. Diligently, without lifting their heads, they copied patterns onto parchment. Rathole was accessible only by a narrow mountain road that climbed steeply, mimicking the crooked lanes of the village itself. I intended to stay there for a fortnight, sketching the surroundings. The village boasted an old-fashioned inn, the sole survivor of a Spanish naval bombardment in 1500 and something. Nothing more than a legend, Raymond interrupted irritably. It's foolish to repeat it. But darling, the locals insisted the Spaniards landed on the coast, hauled up their cannons, lit the fuses, and bang, bang, half the houses were gone. But that's beside the point. The inn, it had preserved its antique flavor perfectly, with a wide porch and 4 peeling columns supporting a canopy over the steps. I decided then and there to paint that peculiar portal, but I had scarcely found a spot for my easel when a car, gleaming with nickel trim, came rattling down the hill. Breaking by the inn, it blocked my view entirely. A young couple stepped out. Irritated by the interruption, I paid them little mind, catching only a glimpse of the woman's mauve dress and a matching hat with a drooping brim. The man soon returned, took the wheel, and moved the car to the parking area by the quay. No sooner had he left than another car of the same make rolled up. At the wheel sat a lady dressed in a garish crimson outfit, the likes of which I had never seen. Her raspberry-colored straw hat, however, looked as though it had come from a bargain bin. She didn't stop at the inn but drove straight to the parking lot. Returning on foot, she easily overtook the driver of the first car. He threw his arms up in immense surprise. "Why, Carol, dear. Isn't it a marvel to run into each other here, in this God-forsaken hole, after all these years? Marjorie, my wife, is here. Come, let me introduce you." As they strolled slowly up the street, Marjorie appeared on the porch and walked down to meet them. One fleeting glance at Carol as she passed was enough for me to judge her taste. Powder practically cascaded from her chin, and her lips glistened with rouge. I doubted Marjorie would be thrilled by such an acquaintance. Then again, Marjorie herself struck me as rather dowdy and plain. Naturally, the newcomers were of no interest to me. It is simply that one often becomes an involuntary witness to the actions of others. Snatches of their conversation drifted my way, talk of swimming and seaside amusements. The man, a Mr. Dennis, was tempting both ladies with a boat trip. There was a charming grotto nearby that would be a sin to miss. Carol agreed but suggested going on foot over the cliffs. She couldn't stand the rocking of a boat. They argued noisily until a compromise was reached. Carol would walk along the shore and wait for them, while Dennis and Marjorie would row to the grotto. I felt the pull of the water myself. The day was sweltering, and my work was progressing poorly. I quieted my conscience with the thought that the evening light might be more effective, packed my things, and soon found myself on a tiny, secluded beach I had recently discovered. It sat on the far side of the mountain from the famous grotto. Having swum my fill, I basked on the hot sand like a lizard, took a quick lunch of a slice of tongue and 2 tomatoes, and returned to the inn after midday, refreshed and eager to finish my sketch. The village seemed drowsy. The inn was beautifully lit by the slanting sun. My hopes were fully realized. As I settled at my easel, I noticed 2 bathing suits, one red, one blue, draped over the balcony railing on the upper floor. So, the travelers had also returned. For a while, I didn't look up from the canvas, working on a complex detail. When I finally raised my head, my eyes met a stranger standing on the porch, leaning casually against a column. Where he had come from, I couldn't say. He looked like a mariner, indistinguishable from the local fisherman, with a bushy black beard. Had I been looking to paint a Spanish pirate, I couldn't have found a better model. I began greedily sketching his figure, terrified he might walk away. But the stranger stood motionless. By the time he finally sauntered over to me, the sketch was done. The fellow proved to be quite talkative, and for the umpteenth time, I was forced to listen to the whole history of the bombardment, that is, the destruction of the village, as well as the dramatic demise of the innkeeper, whom a Spanish sword had pierced at his own front door. Blood was spilled upon the steps, the stranger concluded. And from that day to this, for centuries now, nothing can wash away the bloodstains. I confess, a shiver ran through me. The dead silence of the village and this man with his slow, lazy voice, in which a hard note lingered, it all seemed to transport me back to those ancient times of the Inquisition and dark crimes. As I listened, I continued almost mechanically to paint the inn, when I suddenly realized I had depicted something that wasn't there. On the sun-drenched steps, I had painted traces of blood. It is truly startling, the tricks the subconscious plays on us. But imagine my horror when, gazing intently at the porch, I truly saw scarlet drops upon the white stone. To keep from screaming, I bit my lip hard. My brush had captured exactly what my eyes had seen. Closing them tight, I repeated to myself, "Pull yourself together, you fool, there is nothing there." But when I forced my lashes open, I saw the opposite. The traces of blood had not vanished. It was unbearable. I was shaking. Stammering, I interrupted the mariner, who was still droning on about something. "Forgive me, I am nearsighted. Are those spots still there, in that same place?" He looked at me with a patronizing smirk. "Of course not. After 500 years, they've faded away." "You're right, of course, but you see." I thought I saw, the words stuck in my throat. Even if he saw nothing, I saw it. With trembling hands, I folded my easel and wiped my brushes. At that moment, the morning traveler appeared on the steps. He descended the porch, glancing about anxiously. The street was deserted. His wife flitted across the balcony above, taking down the now dry bathing suits. Apparently not finding whom he sought, the young man started toward the quay where his car was parked, but he suddenly changed his mind and turned sharply back. "Tell me, my good man," he said, approaching the mariner, "did you happen to notice if the owner of that car over there has returned to the inn? The mistress in that bright raspberry dress, like a whole garden?" "No, I haven't seen her since I met her this morning up in the rocks." "She was heading toward the grotto then." "Precisely. The 3 of us went for a swim. But she was returning home alone, and she hasn't been seen since." "I trust your cliffs aren't dangerous?" "Hard to say, sir. There are all sorts of paths. Strangers do best to hire a guide." He drew himself up, clearly hinting at his own services. Inspired by a new topic, he launched into tales of the recklessness of tourists. The young man was in no mood to listen. He turned away unceremoniously and tilted his head up toward the balcony. "Marjorie," he called to his wife. "Carol hasn't turned up yet." Strange, don't you think? His wife, her back to us, answered something indistinguishable. At any rate, we can't afford to linger. It's time we drove to Pepperthers. Are you ready? I'm going for the car. Come down. Only after they had driven away did I emerge from my stupor. To finally shake off the recent nightmare, I resolutely crossed the street, climbed the inn's porch, and leaned down toward the steps. Of course, there were no stains. My imagination had led me too far. Yet, for some reason, the unease did not vanish. I stood there in confusion, staring at my feet. Behind me, the mariner's voice rang out. Are you sure you saw blood, madam? I nodded silently. You see, he hesitated, there's a local belief that if someone catches sight of those traces, then soon, he fell silent. What will happen? Why, simply that within 24 hours, a corpse will turn up. I shuddered. I can show you, he continued, an old inscription in our church. A similar case occurred. No, thank you, I said, turning my back on him decisively. And in that instant, I spotted that very woman, Carol, on the mountain path above the inn. She was hurrying, almost running, and against the backdrop of the bare gray rocks, her crimson dress looked like an exotic flower. It looked as though her hat, too, had been dipped in a pool of blood. I shook my head to dispel the hallucination. Hearing the roar of her car, I thought perhaps she had decided to catch up with her acquaintances. But Carol turned in the opposite direction from Pepperthers. Watching the puffing, jolting car disappear over the stones, I breathed a sigh of relief. The village of Rathole could return to its eternal slumber. Joyce fell silent. Raymond West could not suppress the caustic remark that had been on the tip of his tongue for some time. If that is the whole of your story, my dear, I can explain it very simply. You were overheated by the sun and ate too much raw fruit. That often causes spots before the eyes. Don't be so quick to conclude, my friend. First, listen to the rest. A few days later, I came across a newspaper headline, Fatal Bathing Accident. It reported that a Mrs. Dacre, wife of Captain Davis Dacre, had drowned in Lander Cove, near a resort on the north coast of Cornwall. The details were simple. The aforementioned couple had gone for a swim upon arrival, but a cold wind picked up and Captain Dacre preferred a round of golf. Mrs. Dacre went down to the beach alone. When she failed to return, her worried husband, along with a party of golfers, went in search of her. They found only her clothes on the sand, and the poor woman's body washed ashore only a week later, south of Lander Cove. The cause of death was a deep wound to the head. Apparently, the deceased had dived incautiously and struck an underwater rock. Involuntarily comparing the dates, I realized that the death occurred exactly 24 hours after I had imagined seeing blood on the steps. I protest, Sir Henry intervened. This is not a criminal case, but a ghost story. Miss Lemprière clearly has the inclinations of a clairvoyant. Mr. Petherick cleared his throat with his usual delicacy. The head wound troubles me, he said. One cannot rule out a criminal staging. Though I admit there are no hard facts. Miss Lemprière's hallucination was remarkably well timed, but what threads does it offer toward a solution? Sunstroke, Raymond West persisted, wishing to tease his friend. Besides, are we even talking about the same person? Furthermore, if a fatal curse exists, logic dictates it applies only to the inhabitants of Rathole, does it not? Could the mysterious mariner be involved in the murder? Sir Henry murmured thoughtfully. Though Mr. Petherick is right, there is too little data in the narrative. Joyce turned inquiringly to Dr. Pender, who had not yet spoken. A gripping tale, the doctor said with a pleasant smile, but I confess, my dear miss, that to make even a suggestion, I find myself lacking in detail. Miss Marple joined the conversation. It was to her that Joyce turned a hopeful gaze. You haven't been quite fair, my dear, to our gentlemen, to our most learned friends, said Miss Marple. I, of course, am another matter. Women notice clothes first of all. Whereas it simply wouldn't occur to a man that an outfit can be changed very quickly. Yes, that person was very cunning, and her accomplice was cruel. Joyce's eyes widened. Aunt Jane, she burst out, but catching herself immediately, she corrected herself with embarrassment. Miss Marple, could you really have known the denouement from the very start? Oh no, child. But when one sits aside like this, with one's knitting in hand, nothing distracts from the story and the small details do not escape. I am in a much better position than you were at the time, when you were entirely gripped by the atmosphere of the uncanny. The blood was dripping from a bathing suit, for the balcony was situated right over the steps, was it not? The criminals didn't think of that. Yes, poor creature. Forgive me, Miss Marple, Sir Henry interrupted, looking bewildered. I have the impression that you and Miss Lemprière are speaking a language I don't quite follow. Since it all seems clear to you, do us a kindness and explain the riddle to us poor, thick-headed men. Very well, Joyce agreed, I shall finish the story. A year later, I went out sketching again in a coastal fishing village. One morning, as I was working diligently, I was struck by the uncanny feeling that the exact same scene I had once witnessed was playing out before my eyes. A few steps away stood a young couple, and the man was brightly hailing a lady in a garish crimson and scarlet outfit. Hello, Carol. It's a positive miracle to run into you here after all these years. Joan, darling, this is Miss Harding, an old acquaintance of mine. I recognized the man instantly. It was Dennis from Rathole. But his companion was different. Her name was no longer Marjorie but Joan, though she was the same type as the deceased, a nondescript, plump little blonde. My suspicions were aroused, and since the conversation immediately turned to going for a swim, I wasted no time and hurried to the local police station. Even if they had taken me for a madwoman, it wouldn't have stopped me. As it turned out, Dacre was already under the surveillance of a Scotland Yard inspector who had followed him there. The name Dacre was, of course, an alias. He changed them as needed. The scoundrel would seek out modest, unremarkable girls with no relatives, insure their lives for a large sum, and then, oh, it's too terrible to think about. His real wife was Carol. They repeated the same script time and again, which eventually aroused the suspicion of the insurance companies. Dacre, I shall continue to call him that, would bring a fresh victim to a secluded resort where, as if by chance, they would encounter his accomplice, and all three would go for a swim. The unfortunate girl would be murdered, Carol would put on the victim's dress, and she and Dacre would return together in the boat. They would leave the hotel very quickly, loudly expressing their bewilderment over their vanished friend. As soon as the car was out of sight, Carol would change back into her own dress, usually something very bright and noticeable from a distance, apply heavy makeup, and soon depart the area herself. Having studied the ocean currents, the killers almost always knew when and where the body would wash ashore. Posing as a touring married couple, they would settle nearby, and on the appointed day, Carol would go for a swim in some hidden corner of the coast. She would leave the murdered woman's clothes on the sand and slip away to a prearranged spot to wait for Dacre. I believe that while murdering poor Marjorie, Carol didn't notice the blood splash onto her, and the red bathing suit absorbed the incriminating drops. Those were the drops falling from the balcony onto the steps of the porch. Believe me, that horrific sight remains before my eyes to this day, Joyce concluded, turning slightly pale. I remember the case now, Sir Henry added. I had simply forgotten that Dacre was one of the criminal's many names. Quite a subtle scheme. I recall being puzzled at the time by how one woman could be substituted for another so unnoticed. It only confirms Miss Marple's observation, men pay attention to the individual, not the clothes. Yes, exposing Dacre took a great deal of work, as he always had an impeccable alibi. Miss Marple, Raymond asked, Looking at the old lady with affectionate curiosity, how did you deduce all this? Has anything similar ever happened in your peaceful little backwater? You see, my boy, there is nothing new under the sun. You might remember Mrs. Green, who lost 5 children, every one of them insured. Eventually, the whole village was saying it couldn't be a coincidence. What can one do? There is no place, even the quietest, where evil does not reside. I only wish you young people didn't have to encounter the cruel underside of the world.